guys, how are you? First off, thank you very much for coming down today. I appreciate it's a free event, but you're paying with your time and with your attention, and there isn't too many more important things in the world as far as I'm concerned. I'd like to also say thanks to Iconic Offices for having me in, and to Christina and Michelle for organising everything. So, just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I'm going to try and use the chat box quite extensively today, just for a little bit of interaction with you guys, but also to get maybe a little bit of feedback. And if you guys have any questions, etc., we're going to try and use the chat box to answer those. So if I could just ask you guys just very quickly, just to make sure the chat box is working for me, could I ask, how is everybody doing today? How's your week been? How's your day been? How's everything going? Maybe just let me know in the chat box there if that's okay. So if people have questions, or if I'm going too fast or too slow, please let me know in the chat box. I've got a separate screen set up to keep an eye on it. So I'd really like to use it. And finally, if anyone has got a pen and a piece of paper, I will be putting you to work a little bit during this talk. So you might find it very useful to have. So that's great. Laura, thanks so much. Thanks for interacting. Cheers, Julie. Thank you very much. Cheers, Sonia. Hi, Michelle. How are you? Hope you're all good. Cheers, Nadi. Thanks, Samantha. So Samita's joining us from India, which I think is pretty amazing. And relaxing day so far. See, well, hopefully we won't make it too stressful for you from here on in. Okay. So I suppose just to introduce myself, so my name is Jason Moran, and I am a coaching psychologist. So I help professionals and entrepreneurs increase their impact and increase their effectiveness. And I do this by kind of looking at three main questions, or looking at three main areas. So firstly, I help people to better understand themselves. We're looking at the kind of question of who you are, kind of where you're at in your life right now. So we might look at maybe things like your personality. We might look at how you're doing in various aspects of your life and how that's balanced. Or maybe we might look at your career, and we might look at your performance in various aspects of your job, or maybe various aspects of your business. The second area that I tend to help people in is in terms of helping them to better understand what it is that they want. So we're looking at, what are your goals? What are your aims? What is it that you're trying to achieve? So I suppose we might look at how those goals are structured. Are you clear? Have you got a clear plan in place? And I suppose, is this plan in line with what's really important to you? Is it in line with the person that you are? The third area that I tend to help people with is to understand what's getting in the way to them achieving those goals. So those barriers can be both psychological and practical in nature. So more practical goal or barriers can be things like getting organized, decision making or problem solving, or a more psychological barriers can be things like stress, procrastination, confidence, or motivation. So today I am going to talk a little bit about finding meaning and purpose. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, first off, what are meaning and purpose and why are they so important? And then I'm going to talk about some strategies that we can use in order to get more meaning and purpose into our lives. So I'm going to jump right into it. So in terms of what meaning and purpose is, a definition I really like is by a psychologist by the name of Michael Steger. So Steger kind of, when he talks about meaning, he kind of says it's got kind of two main elements or two main components. So the first of these is comprehension, and then we've got purpose. So comprehension is about that in order to have meaning in our lives, we have to understand ourselves and understand our place in the world. And then based on that understanding of ourselves and the place in the world, we can then figure out a purpose. Or I suppose another way of thinking about a purpose is kind of goals. So just to talk a little bit about purpose first. So I suppose the psychological textbook definition is that purpose is the motivational component of meaning. So it refers to an individual's long-term or overarching goals to which they're highly committed and actively engaged. So our purpose has kind of got two main elements. It's kind of got that, I suppose, that overall mission or plan or goal, and it's also, there's a motivational element to it. So just to talk a little bit more about purpose and goals, maybe the difference in them a little bit. First off, our purpose is kind of broader than our goals. In fact, it helps inform them and helps define them. So for example, I suppose my little spiel there about my business, the purpose of my business is to help people better understand themselves, their aims, and the barriers, the things that are getting in the way. And so from that kind of broad purpose, then I will kind of create, I suppose, more specific goals. So for example, this talk is, aimed to help people better understand themselves. I'll create workshops, or I'll create coaching programs. So I suppose our broader purpose informs our goals. A second very important point about goals and purpose is that not all goals stem from our purpose. And so often our goals can stem from what's called extrinsic motivation, which is also known as, I suppose, external motivation, or motivation that comes from outside us. So this is often very much associated with reward and punishment. We tend to do things to gain reward or avoid punishment. So for example, if you want to think of a student, let's call him Timmy, and Timmy is studying in school. And the reason he's studying hard is that he wants to gain the praise of his teachers, again, the praise of his parents, or maybe he's studying hard in order to avoid detention or avoid doing badly in school. So these are kind of external sources of motivation. The opposite of this, in a lot of ways, is what's called intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is motivation that comes from inside us. And intrinsic motivation is important because really when a goal, for a goal to be meaningful, it should represent the self. And this is why understanding ourselves, I suppose, is so important. So I suppose intrinsic motivation, it's kind of like that natural inclination we have towards curiosity and exploration, towards mastery or getting better with things, and like spontaneous interests. So kids have this in spades. If you ever see how a kid interacts with the world, naturally so curious. They are always trying to get better at things. They're always trying to master things. And they're always spontaneously interested. They're interested in things just for the sake of being interested in them. So intrinsic motivation is there to kind of serve kind of three key needs that we have. It's the need of autonomy, the need of competence, and the need of relatedness. So for example, if we want to go back to our example of Timmy is studying, and maybe Timmy is studying because rather than it being for praise or external motivation, maybe Timmy is studying because he wants to become a doctor. And so maybe he wants to become a doctor because, being a doctor is a good job and it would allow him financial independence from his parents. So it helps him become more autonomous, or it serves that kind of need of autonomy. Or maybe he's studying hard because he wants to become a doctor because he wants to become a great doctor, because he wants to be competent. He wants to get good at something. Or maybe Timmy is studying to be a doctor because what he really wants to do is help people. So what's important to Timmy is relatedness and connection. And so that's kind of the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. One is internal and one is external. Okay. So why is meaning so important? Well, I have three kind of main reasons that I think meaning is very important. Firstly, our meaning, or I suppose having a strong sense of why, gives us direction. So having a strong why helps us figure out our what and our how. So for example, if what's important to you, if your why is maybe something like financial security, maybe your what is that you start saving, and how you do that is you go and open a bank account. Or maybe your why is that you want to be healthier, and so what you decide to do is you want to start eating healthier or start working out. And so how you go about doing that is maybe you go work with a nutritionist, or maybe you go and join a gym. Maybe your why is growth. Maybe you want to get better at stuff. So maybe your what is, do you decide that you're going to start learning some things, and how you go about doing that is you sign up for a college course. So meaning is very important. Defining our why will help define our what and our how. Another reason that meaning is very important is it's very important in terms of our motivation. So for example, people who've got a strong sense of meaning in their jobs tend to enjoy their work more, and so they tend to work harder. Meaning is also very important in terms of, or having a strong sense of meaning is very important in terms of overcoming barriers. So for example, I suppose if you want to achieve anything like amazing or difficult, chances are you're going to have to put up with things like, tiredness, maybe fear, maybe even boredom if what you're doing is going to take a long time. So having a strong sense of meaning, having a strong why is very important in terms of overcoming, I suppose, barriers and persevering. The third reason that I think meaning is very important is that it is very much linked to our happiness. So people who tend to have a strong sense of meaning in their lives tend to report being happier. They tend to experience much more positive emotion. They tend to report being much more satisfied with their lives. And people who've got a strong sense of meaning also report lower levels of stress, depression, and mental illness. So people with a strong sense of meaning tend to, I suppose, be happier and suffer less from, I suppose, negative emotion. Very much linked to this is that people who've got a strong sense of meaning in their lives also tend to have better physical health and well-being. And the reason for that appears to be is that people with more meaning tend to be happier, and happier people tend to be healthier both physically and mentally. Okay, suppose that's why I think meaning is important. How do we go about getting more meaning in our lives? Well, I'm going to put forward three kind of ways that I feel we can get more meaning into our lives, kind of based on the science and based on my own experience dealing with clients. So I suppose the point to make about this is this cannot be comprehensive, that there is many, many, many different ways of having meaning and purpose in your life. But I think these are three important ways that we can. So firstly, I'm going to suggest that we can find meaning by acting in line with what's important. We can find meaning by facing our challenges, and we can find meaning in the individual moral choices and actions that we take on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to jump right into it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is finding meaning by defining what's really important to us and acting in line with this. So I'm going to ask you guys a question. I'd like you to put your answers into the chat box if that's okay. At the very least, I want you to write down the answers to this question because we're going to come back to it a little bit later. So if I could ask you guys, what are the 3 most important things for you in the world right now? We just write them down. It'd be great if you could put them into the chat box as well. I'd be very interested what people are finding important at the minute. So I suppose I'll use an example from my own life just to kind of show you what I mean. So for me, the 3 most important things for me in the world right now are my business. I've just kind of started this recently, so it's very important to me. My sense of creativity. If I'm not doing something creative in my day-to-day, I tend to get very bored and listless if I'm not building something. And finally, my family and partner, which I suppose I class as one thing. And they're, I suppose, important to me for obvious reasons. Okay, so let's just see what people are saying here. Family and stability, very good, Nina. Family seems to be one that will come up a lot on this. The happiness of my parents, my PhD thesis, and success, very good, Samita. So you can see how they're very much related to those intrinsic motivators of, I suppose, connectedness and relatedness, of competence, of getting better with things, you know, and maybe also with autonomy, because I mean, doing a PhD thesis and success, what that allows you is freedom to make your own decisions and autonomy. Laura, health, security, and a feeling of belonging. I think health is a very important one because I think if we don't have that, and when that kind of goes, we can kind of see how really important it is because nothing else really starts to matter, I suppose. Health, happiness, and freedom. Very good, Donald. Family, buying a house, and health. So again, that's pretty much related to the connectedness and relatedness. Buying a house has got to do with autonomy. I mean, it's yours, and your health. It's obviously health, motivation, and people around me, relationships, self-development and learning, helping people, and love. See, this connection, this intrinsic need to connect with people is obviously very important. Creativity, connections in nature, my family, health, my son and my husband by Hugh, family, financial security and health, getting to know who I really am, very good. So that's kind of, I suppose that's almost very much linked to competence as well. G. Hattie and Paul Burke, family, health and peace. I like those 3, Paul. And I suppose you can see how they're very much related to those kind of 3 factors of intrinsic motivation, you know, or need to be autonomous, or need to be connected, and or need to be competent, or need to be good at things. Okay. So another way of thinking about what's really important to us in our life is what's called values. And I think some of the examples you guys kind of put up for me there are very much linked to values. And so what's a value? A value is like a belief or a rule or an attitude about what's really important. And they're also kind of a moral compass. They help us decide, you know, what's right and what's wrong. You know? So we tend to have values in kind of 4 key areas. We tend to have values around, or we tend to think about what's important in terms of what we want for ourselves. So maybe these are things like wealth or health or security. And so I suppose I'm using examples here, but these only kind of touch on things that we might want for ourselves. I'm going to talk about some more kind of different areas we have values in as well. But I suppose the point is I suppose it's almost limitless, or we can at least have tens or hundreds of different values. A second area we tend to have strong values in is about what it is that we want to become. So maybe growth is important to you, maybe ambition is important to you, or maybe wisdom is important to you. A third area we tend to have very strong values around is what it is that we want from others. So maybe connection is very important to us. Maybe respect is more important, or maybe privacy is very important to us. And finally, we tend to have very strong values about what it is that we want from society. So maybe it's tolerance, maybe it's freedom, maybe it's equality. And I think, I suppose, a lot of the major world events in the last couple of years, whether it's the marriage equality thing, which, you know, would show that kind of a lot of people want tolerance in society, or I suppose the protests in Hong Kong, which show kind of freedom is very, very important to people, or the protests in America around George Floyd show that equality is very important to people. I suppose an interesting point about values is there's often a hierarchy to them, that I suppose when push comes to shove, often one thing can be more important to another, and this often kind of drives our behavior and what we do. So for example, you know, your wealth and your health might be both important to you, but I suppose, you know, if you work maybe 80 hours a week, in order to make a lot of money, that might kind of show to you that at the moment anyway, that maybe your wealth is more important to you than your health. And this is the interesting thing about values, is often they're very unconscious to us. And it's only when they start to come into conflict and things like this that we become much more aware of them. And often a way that we can kind of notice when they come into conflict is we tend to feel emotions, often negative emotion. So values are very much linked to emotions. We tend to feel positive emotions when the world and ourselves live in line with our values, and we tend to feel negative emotions when the world and ourselves don't live in line with our values. So, for example, if wealth is very important to you and you happen to come across or make a lot of money, then you're probably going to feel very satisfied, content, happy. You're going to feel positive emotion. Whereas if wealth is important to you and you end up losing a load of money for some reason, maybe the stock market plunge that's happened recently because of COVID, then you're liable to feel maybe sad or angry because, you know, if wealth is important to you and you lose it, then you're going to feel those negative emotions. So the fact that emotions are very much linked to our values, it can really help us in terms of putting our finger on what's really, really important to us. So one thing I'll often do with clients in terms of figuring out what's really important or what their values are, is we have a look at kind of peak emotional moments. So we might have a look at, you know, when someone was most satisfied or when they were most proud or when they were most content. So when I think of an example from my own life, recently in the last couple of years, is I was at a wedding. And I suppose at the wedding, I was connected with a lot of very good people, a lot of very good friends. People were doing very nice things to each other and for each other. And I suppose that would suggest to me that connection is kind of a key value or something that's very important to me. Another emotion that's very important in terms of putting our finger on our values is anger. You know, what really pisses us off, what really makes us angry. So when I think of myself, when I think of a moment in my life when I was very, very angry, I was working a job a few years ago and I felt I was being treated very unfairly. And that made me very, very angry to the point that I left the job. And that would suggest that, I suppose, fairness is a very important value. Another way of putting our finger on what our values are is you have to think in your life, you know, what are your must-haves? What are the things you have to have in your day-to-day? And so if I'm not building something or if I'm not doing something creative, I tend to get very bored and listless in my work. And so that would suggest to me that creativity is very important. A book I really like in this topic, and I'll have to excuse the language here for a few minutes, is by a gentleman called Mark Manson, called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck, let's call it. So Manson in the book, I suppose the main message is it's very important to define your values and to live in line with them, kind of what I'm saying earlier. And I suppose there's lots of books that say that, but I think Manson makes some very, very good points around values and why they're so important. And one of the points he makes I really like is that we all have a limited amount of cognitive and emotional resources. So it's really important to pay attention to who you spend those cognitive resources on and where you spend them. So for example, you know, if you're spending a lot of time surfing the internet and or watching random videos on YouTube, or if you're spending a lot of time on social media, or if you're spending a lot of your cognitive energy and your emotional resources on maybe comparing yourself to other people on social media, is that the best use of your time? You know, if you're worried about multiple maybe unimportant things, or maybe you're worried about what other people think or what other people are saying, this is, I suppose, in Manson's view, not a good use of your cognitive and emotional resources. Because if you're spending your, I suppose, thinking energy and your emotional energy on these things, you're not spending them on the important things. So we've got a quote in a book that I really, really like. Again, you'll have to excuse the language here. But he says, the key to a good life is not giving a feck about more, but it's about giving a feck about less. And giving a feck about only what is true and immediate and important. So Manson really put forward the point that it's very important to care about less things and to focus on the really important things so we can put as much energy into those as possible. But based on that, I suppose I'd ask you guys, you know, what are the three most important things for you in the world right now? And I've got some really good answers. What I'd like to ask you guys, the next question is, you know, did your actions in the last 24 hours reflect this? Maybe let me know in the chat box, you know, did you do anything, I suppose, or have you done anything that, you know, have you taken an action? Have you done something that shows that, you know, those three things he said were important? Have you integrated it into your life? You know, have you, I suppose, honored those values, so to speak? I'm very interested. Just let me know in the chat box. No? Okay. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. Samantha, you'd asked, is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck a counterintuitive and kind of rebellious book? It's a very counterintuitive book. I suppose the title of the book is all about it's not about not caring, I suppose. It's all about caring about the important things. So it's I highly recommend. It's a very entertaining book. Check out the Audible, but he makes some very, 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 very good points. Really like that book. Okay, partially. Sonia, 2 out of 3 in the last 24 hours. Okay. Okay. Fair enough if you don't want to get too involved in the chat box and that, and admitting to what you've honored. But what I will ask you, and you don't have to put this in the chat box, but maybe write this down, is what one thing could you do in the next 24 hours to act in line with what's important? What one action could you take? So I talked about my 3 important things being my creativity, my business, and my family and partner. And when I asked myself, did my actions in the last 24 hours reflect this? Well, I have to say I've done something creative in terms of putting this talk together. I've been working on my business, obviously, because this is part of it. But I suppose maybe because I've been busy with those 2 things, maybe I haven't given enough attention to my family and my partner. And maybe there's something that I should do in the next 24 hours to do this. So I'm going to put away some time this evening to spend some time with my wonderful partner, who's on the call here as well. And so maybe we'll have a little bit of a date night later. Okay. So the second way we can find meaning, or more meaning, in our lives, I'm going to put forward, is that we can find meaning in facing our challenges. A book I really like about this is an oldie but a goodie. It's by a guy called Joseph Campbell, and it's called Hero of a Thousand Faces. And so The Hero of a Thousand Faces is a book about a story, and it's a particular story called The Hero's Journey. So here's the hero's journey in Campbell's words. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. So we have someone, they're going about their day to day, then they go on an amazing adventure, they face a really big challenge, they overcome it, and as a result of overcoming it, they learn things and they gain things, and then they bring that back and share it with the people who are important in their lives. So that's kind of the idea of the hero's journey. And Campbell talks about stories and how important they are, and why stories are important is that stories let us explore what it's like to be human. Stories are often a metaphor for life. And the hero in the hero's journey and in these stories generally is someone who gives their life over to a challenge, and often a challenge that's bigger than themselves. So for example, the hero's journey it's across all societies. It's been across since ancient history, since the first recording of stories, the hero's journey has been, it's a story arc that's always been there. So for example, it is the story arc of Jesus in the Bible. It is the story arc of the Buddha. It is the story arc of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It's more modern. It's the story arc of Iron Man in the Avengers. It's the story arc of Frodo from Lord of the Ring. And finally, it's also one of my favorites. It's the story arc of Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. So just to go a little bit more into the details of the hero's journey, and I'm going to use the example of Luke Skywalker from Star Wars to, I suppose, demonstrate the hero's journey. So the hero starts off in an ordinary place, and he's an ordinary person in an ordinary world. So in Star Wars, Luke is just a farmer in like a small planet in the corner of the galaxy, very unimportant. So then our hero, Luke, meets some mentors and friends who encourage him to go on an adventure. So Luke meets Obi-Wan Kenobi and then Yoda, who are his mentors. And in terms of friends, he meets Han Solo and Chewie, among others. They will be 2 of the main ones. And so off they go on their adventure, and then they face some pretty major challenges. So in Star Wars, the challenges Luke faces are Darth Vader. He's got to overcome him, and he's got to destroy the Death Star. And so once he's done that, once the hero has overcome his challenge, then he's rewarded. And he's usually rewarded with knowledge and insight. So in the case of Star Wars, Luke is reunited with his long-lost father. And I suppose the knowledge and insight, he learns that, love is very important and love conquers all. And they bring this back, and as a result, the galaxy is saved. So that's kind of the hero's journey generally. So a very important point about the hero's journey is you see there at the bottom of the diagram, our hero always faces a challenge. And I suppose in ancient mythology, this was often put forward as the idea of a dragon. And what a dragon is, it's a big, scary monster, often that kind of mines a treasure or mines a golden hoard. But I suppose a dragon is a big, scary challenge that we often face. And that's what it's a metaphor for. And the interesting thing about the hero's journey is that the hero couldn't exist without their challenge. In fact, the challenge that the hero faces is what defines them as a hero. And more so, it's not even that what their challenge defines them, it's their response to that challenge that defines them. So, for example, Luke wouldn't have really been anybody. He would have been just another farm boy in the far end of the galaxy. Only Darth Vader was his father, and he had to. He was the only one who could really challenge him. Frodo in Lord of the Rings would have been just another normal hobbit. Only he had to destroy the ring because that was his particular destiny. So I suppose our heroes can't be heroes without their challenges or without their dragons that they need to overcome. And what's interesting about this is really it's the challenge that the hero faces that makes their journey meaningful. Yeah. So we can, I suppose the point of, or Campbell's point in the book is that we can find meaning by facing these challenges. So for example, two of the most meaningful things I've done in my life, in my 20s, I suffered really badly with anxiety. And so I spent a couple of years in therapy and doing a lot of work on that, and overcoming that was very, very meaningful. Similarly, a couple of years ago, I had a huge fear of public speaking, and I suppose overcoming that is something that was very, very meaningful as well. And I suppose an important point about these things, especially when I was starting to face them, they felt like big, scary dragons. They were things that I didn't want to face. And I suppose when I work with clients now, I often kind of, I suppose, help them overcome their dragons to an extent as well. So maybe your dragon is anger or procrastination, or maybe it's confidence, or maybe it's assertiveness. These are just some of the things. But I suppose often when people come to deal with these kind of things, they often see them as bad things, when in fact, I suppose the journey and overcoming these things mean that we can kind of gain a lot of meaning in terms of what we're doing, and it's very meaningful. So rather than focus on the dragon, so to speak, you can focus on the gold that it's minding, So it's the benefits and the meaning that you can get from facing these challenges. So if I was to ask you guys, maybe in the chat box, just let me know. I'm very curious, who is your hero or your heroine and why? Please let me know in the chat box. I'm going to give you guys a second to think about that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one of mine. So one of my heroes is a gentleman called Mark Pollock. I actually met him when I was working in the restaurant industry years ago, and he came in for a lunch one day, and just a very amazing guy. And so Mark is, when he was 5 years of age, he lost his eyesight it was his left eye in a childhood accident. Was always a very sporty kid, so he decided to get into rowing because it was a sport he could do, even despite the fact he only had sight in one eye. And he became a very successful rower. And unfortunately, when he was 22, in a rowing accident, ironically enough, he lost the sight in his other eye. So he became blind at the age of 22. So Mark didn't let this stop him. What he went on to do is he went on to win 2 medals in the Commonwealth Games for Northern Ireland in rowing. He also was the first blind person to trek to the South Pole on foot. And he ran 6 marathons in 7 days in the Gobi Desert in order to raise money for charity. He also became a public speaker, and his MO was to engage the audience to help them achieve more than they thought possible. So I suppose what Mark wanted to show is, even though you have a disability or even though you have a challenge or something holding you back, it doesn't mean you can't achieve amazing things. So unfortunately, in 2010, when Mark was 34, he was speaking at an event in London, and he stayed in a friend's house, and he got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It was a very warm evening. His friend ended up leaving a bay window open, and the apartment was on the 3rd or 4th floor. So Mark ended up falling out the window in the middle of the night and becoming paralyzed from the waist down. So again, obviously after a period of recuperation, he didn't let that hold him back. He set up what's called the Mark Pollock Trust. So the Mark Pollock Trust is a charity. They run some very famous events. I don't know if you've heard of Run in the Dark. So that's an event where people run at night time, I suppose maybe to simulate the idea of running while blind. And the purpose of Run in the Dark and the rest of the Mark Pollock Trust's charities is to raise money for what's called Project Walk. So the idea with the Mark Pollock Trust is that he wants to try to find a cure for paralysis for him and everyone else in his lifetime. And so what he's done is he's raised money in order to bring together the world's best spinal specialists, the world's best neuroscientists, the world's best robotics experts, in order to try to find a cure for cancer or a cure for paralysis. And actually, Mark has managed to lift his legs using electrical stimulation of his spine, and he's also managed to walk under his own steam using robotics, based on the work that Project Walk has done. So you know what? He might actually get there. I suppose what I like about Mark is that I suppose he's obviously had some very major problems or challenges, but I'd say you could define him by his response to them. He really took them on, and really tried to kind of make the world a better place as a result of his own challenges and problems. Okay, so I'd ask you guys who is your hero or your heroine and why. I didn't get a lot of response in the chat box there. Just making sure, can everyone still hear me and stuff? Yeah, that's okay. I suppose if, okay, cool, no worries. Okay, so we can come back to maybe the idea of heroes and heroines again. So what's the practical takeaways from the hero's journey? Well, first off, I think we can find a lot of meaning by identifying and facing our challenges. So I suppose, figuring out, who your Darth Vader is or what your dragon is, and I suppose working to overcome that can be a very meaningful experience. So for example, maybe your dragon is motivation or procrastination or anger or confidence or fear, or maybe something a little bit more serious like depression and anxiety. And I think by, I suppose, facing up to our challenges and deciding what they are and actually starting to work towards them can be a very meaningful experience. A second lesson I think we can get from the hero's journey is that it's very important to find mentors and friends in order to help us overcome those journeys. So you might need to define who's your Yoda or who's your Gandalf, and who's your Han Solo or your Chewie. So who are the mentors that you can get to help you along the way? So maybe it's an actual mentor, maybe it's a coach, maybe it's a therapist, or maybe it's another expert that can maybe help you overcome your challenges. And also, it's very important not to try and go on that journey alone. So whatever your challenge is, to try and find friends that can, I suppose, go on the journey with you. Finally, I think it's very important in terms of helping, that we can find a lot of meaning by helping others in terms of dealing with their challenges. And I suppose what we often feel like when we're facing a challenge ourselves, we forget that one, there's people who've faced a challenge before and we can get help from them, but also there are probably people who are going to have to face a challenge in the future, and we can find a lot of meaning in terms of helping others. And so we can do that by doing things like sharing our insights, and being there for them, maybe. So I think the meetup situation, I think, is a really good organization that helps people, I suppose, come together and share insights about overcoming their challenges and their journeys. Another one I found very, very useful as well is Toastmasters. I'm sorry, I was talking about meetups. And one I really like for people who are a little bit shy is a meetup called Social Fitness for Introverts. And this is run by introverts. And what they do is they run social events to help people overcome their shyness. I'm very sorry, I had a bit of an issue with my chat and I didn't see you guys have put up some of your heroes. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about those and to see who you guys find inspirational or who you guys think is heroes. So one hero here is Paulo Coelho, a really good book. I can't remember the name of it, that the one he became, the Amethyst, I'm about to say. Maybe if Samantha, if you can put the name of Paulo Coelho's book up, I think people would really find it useful. Very inspirational guy. Christina, my mom, she's a very selfless person. So I suppose the idea of a hero, I suppose, serving someone outside themselves is very important. My vice president and mentor, really strong example on how to be female empowered and still honor who you are. Our heroes are often people who set examples for us. It's very true. J.K. Rowling, Pablo Neruda, and Michelle Obama, very good. Adrienne from Adrienne Yoga. I've started doing some of her yoga recently. Yes, she's excellent. Tom Crean, very good. An Irish Antarctic hero. Amazing. John Hume recently passed away. Very important. Okay, cool. Sorry about that, guys. I was having a bit of an issue with the chat box on my side. Awesome. Okay. So the final thing I want to talk about today is about how we can find meaning in the individual choices that we make on a day-to-day basis and in the actions that we take on a day-to-day basis. So I think the book on this topic is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And so Man's Search for Meaning is a book of two halves. The first half of the book is about the author's experiences in a concentration camp in, I think it's in Poland during World War II. I think it's Auschwitz or Dachau. And so the author Frankl he was a Jewish psychologist and he was interned in this concentration camp. He lost his wife and both his parents. And so the first half of the book is very grim, very heavy reading. But it's worth it for the insights in the second half of the book, where Frankl talks about, I suppose, finding meaning in life, finding meaning more generally. One of the main lessons in the book for me anyway, is that we can find meaning in the moral choices that we make. So there's a quote in the book called, and it goes like this: it's life is questioning you daily, hourly. How do you respond? And what Frankl is talking about there is that I suppose often life poses us kind of moral questions. And I think his experiences in the concentration camp kind of made that very, very obvious to him, made it very, very clear. So, for example, some of the moral questions he would be asked would be very serious on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, did he share his last piece of bread with his also starving fellow inmate? Or did he not inform on a fellow inmate, even though, he himself and everyone he knew would be punished if he didn't inform? Or I suppose more generally, did he just give up or because it was such a horrible situation, or did he actually try to help others? And I suppose in response to these kind of moral questions, we often think, these are tough and that we should, go into deep thought or maybe meditation or maybe look at the old philosophers in terms of trying to figure out what the right response is. And for Frankl, he thought this was the wrong method. This is the wrong way to go about it. That he thought, most of the time we actually know what the right thing is to do in any given situation, that if we look inside ourselves a little bit. And the correct response to these kind of horrible moral questions is to take the right action and take the right conduct, is to do the right thing. And a point that Frankl makes in the book is that we always have a choice in these situations, because he gives the example of the one thing the Nazis couldn't take away from him, even though they could take away his life, is they couldn't take away how he chose to respond to what they did to him. So, for example, he could always choose to share his last piece of bread, or he could always choose to not inform on a fellow inmate, or he could always choose to try and help others rather than give up and die. And I think that this is important in terms of how we can find meaning, because it shows that we can find meaning in how we respond to each individual situation, that we don't have to have a big overarching purpose that's, save the planet or save the Amazon forest, or all great things to have, but I suppose we don't necessarily have to have a big overarching purpose in order to find meaning. I think the COVID situation is a very good example of this and how we can find meaning in those individual moral choices that we make. I'd seen a lot of people chose to socially distance. A lot of people choose to wear a mask out now or on public transport or going into shops because they don't want to infect other people. A lot of people chose to spend 10, 15 minutes even with a socially isolated neighbor or to go shopping for other people. And doing the right thing, making the right moral choices in these, individual instances can be very, very, very meaningful, And I think if there was one positive out of the whole COVID situation is it did present a lot of situations where people did take the right, meaningful choices. Okay, so just to finish up, I'm going to talk about, not only can we choose to make the right decision or do the right thing in terms of our individual choices, we can do that in a bit of a broader sense as well, in that we can choose who we are. So this is very much linked to the idea of identity. So I suppose who we are, or what identity is really, it's, our understanding of who we are, or it's the narrative and story we tell ourselves, about who we are. And so we've got lots of different types of identities, but kind of two important ones are, one, we've got a personal identity. And a personal identity is our understanding of ourselves in terms of our attributes or our skills or traits, so to speak. So we might think of ourselves as outgoing, or we might see ourselves as kind, or we might describe ourselves as hardworking or particularly happy, or maybe we see ourselves as an anxious person. A second type of identity that we have, though, is what's called our social identity. And our social identity is very much linked into our roles in life. So, for example, I've got multiple roles in my life. So I am a son, I'm a psychologist, I'm a brother, I'm a partner, I'm a coach, I'm a speaker. And in the past, I've played roles like I've been the best man. And what's interesting about this is we can play those roles well, or we can play them badly. So we can be a good son, or we can be a bad son. We can be a good psychologist or a bad brother, or a good partner or a bad coach. Or we can be a good speaker, or in the case of being a best man, we can be a good best man or a bad best man. So what has all this got to do with meaning? Well, first off, when we consider where identity comes from, so it turns out our identity, it's something that we actually learn, and how we learn our identity is through our experience of ourselves. We learn who we are, I suppose, by looking at what it is that we do. So we look at our own behaviors, our own habits, the things that we've achieved, and from that we decide, I suppose, who we are to an extent. So for example, I used to work as a bartender back in the day, and as a result, I identified as a bartender because I would do bartender things in my job. My social life was very much based around being a bartender. So I identified as a bartender. What's interesting about this is because part of our identity is based on our behavior, it means that we can change it, because if we change our behavior, that means we can change our identity. So for example, I identify as a psychologist now because I do things that psychologists do. So for example, I do talks on psychological topics, or I work one-on-one with clients. And so what's nice about this kind of social identity in these roles is we can change our identity, we can change our roles by changing our behavior. So what's this got to do with meaning? Well, it turns out that we can find a lot of meaning by playing these roles really, really well. So for example, a role I played a couple of years ago, as I was saying earlier, was I played the role of best man at my brother's wedding. And this is one of the more meaningful experiences in my life. And part of the reason that this was meaningful is that I felt I played the role well. I suppose I did a speech. Everyone seemed to have a laugh and enjoy it. The bride cried, but in a good way. You know, I drank a little, but not too much. You know, I felt I played the role well. Yeah. And so as a result, that was very, very meaningful for me. So in terms of how we can, I suppose we can have meaning by playing a role well, this puts forward that we can increase the level of meaning we have by playing our roles better. And how we play our roles better, how do we improve? We improve by changing our behaviors or doing our behaviors more often. So for example, when I learn a new coaching technique or learn a new bit of psychological theory, which makes me a better coaching psychologist, then it's meaningful because I'm becoming a better psychologist. If I learn a new speaking technique or if I practice a talk, it's meaningful because I'm becoming a better speaker. If I spend time with my family or spend time with my friends, it's meaningful because I'm becoming a better brother or a son or becoming a better friend. And if I learn skills in terms of how to reduce conflict, it's meaningful for me because I'm becoming a better partner. So I'll leave you with this idea that we can find meaning as playing a role well. And what I'd like you to do is take a minute. Maybe you can let me know in the chat box if you'd like, but I think maybe take a pen and a piece of paper. And if you can identify a key role in your life. So we all have multiple roles, maybe just pick one. So maybe a key role in your life is, got to do with your personal relations. Maybe you're a father or a brother or a son or a daughter or a wife or a mother. Or maybe a key role in your life is maybe got to do with your profession, whatever it is you do for a living. Or maybe a key role in your life is your partner. So once you've identified that role, I want you to just take a minute and I want you to write down a couple of things that a person who plays that role really, really well would do. So for example, I'll use the example of a partner. And for me, what a good partner does, or a person who plays that role really, really well would do, is they spend quality time with their partner. Maybe they listen to them, maybe they encourage them, maybe they give them the odd shoulder. And a final question, I suppose, if we can turn this into action rather than being theoretical. If you can write down one thing that you can do in the next 24 hours, maybe put it into the chat box if you'd like. What's one thing you can do in the next 24 hours to play that role a little better, So as I was saying earlier, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a date night tonight because I'm going to try to play the role of partner a little bit better because I've been busy the last couple of days and I haven't been playing that role very, very well. Okay, cool. So just to go to the chat box there for a second. Someone had asked about identity. What do you think of instead of changing an identity, of not having an identity? Hi, Donald. Donald, I suppose, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, obviously, the idea of identity is a concept. So I'm not sure if, whether you agree with the concept or not. I mean, you can decide whether you have an identity or not. But I think, we all have a conception of who we are, and there's different ways we can build that and do that. So I would argue that we might all have an identity, to be honest. Okay. So just to finish up, I talked a little bit about comprehension or about meaning, and how meaning has got kind of two main elements. One is comprehension, about understanding ourselves and our place in the world. And from that understanding, we can help to start to develop our purpose, which is kind of very much related to our goals. So one way of understanding ourselves is figuring out what's important, and our purpose can be maybe acting in line with what we think is important or acting in line with our values. Another way that we can understand ourselves is to understand ourselves by our challenges. What is the dragon that we have to face? And our purpose might be in overcoming that dragon. And the final way I think that we can understand ourselves is to understand ourselves in terms of those individual choices that we make in a day-to-day and those roles that we play in a day-to-day well. And I feel we can find meaning in playing those roles well and making those right moral choices. Okay, thank you very, very much. That is me for today. I'll hang around afterwards if people want for some Q&A, which we probably won't record if people have any questions they want to ask me after the event finishes. But I'll hand you back to Christina now to just wrap up. Thank you very, very much.